Today's question was submitted by David. David wrote in asking, what do we do with the sons of God and the daughters of men in Genesis chapter 6? And so, David, this is a good question. And in fact, Genesis chapter 6 is probably the most problematic text in all of Genesis. It's really difficult for those of you that aren't familiar with what David's asking about. That's fine. It's in Genesis chapter 6, the first 4 verses. We read, "When man began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. And the Lord said, My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh, his days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth also in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of man, they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. So then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. And so the Lord said, I will blot out man, whom I have created from the face of the land, and the animals, and the creeping things, and the birds in the heavens, for I am sorry that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord." So that's the first 8 verses of Genesis chapter 6. What happens after that is that the Lord goes to Noah and tells Noah, here's the boat I want you to build. Noah builds the boat, and then God destroys the land with a flood. And so it all begins in these first 8 verses in Genesis chapter 6, where most of us are familiar with the flood account. But what's funny for us is that we use the flood and use it to put up borders in nurseries of cute little animals on a boat, when it's really the outpouring of God's wrath against the violence of humanity, and has this weird passage about sex and offspring and children and Nephilim and men of renown. It's really a bizarre account. And then even at the end of it, Noah, who is our hero, ends up getting drunk after planting a vineyard, so even the righteous man that is saved ends up having a messy family life. It's the whole thing is a tough story to take. But this issue of the sons of God is kind of at the center of the beginning. Who are they, and what does it have to do with the story? Well, there's 3 basic options for us. The first option is that the sons of God is a term for kings, for aristocracy. And so it's saying that kings were abusing their power and collecting large harems of women, and that showed the pride and violence of their hearts in abusing women, taking advantage of women, and outside of God's design for sexuality. It's possible. That is a traditional Jewish interpretation of the text. A second option is that the sons of God are in the line of Seth, the line of the godly people, and that the sons and the daughters of man are in the line of Cain. And God didn't want his people, his chosen line, the line of Seth, intermarrying with the line of Cain. And so that kind of takes on the flavor of the people of Israel and the laws against intermarrying later with the Canaanites. It imposes it onto this text. It's also the view of John Calvin. He's no slouch theologically. And then a third interpretation is that sons of God is actually a term for angels, angelic beings. In this case, angelic beings who had fallen. So this goes along, you can see this in Job, that it talks about the sons of God approaching God's throne and Satan among them. And so these are angels in that text and in other places in Scripture. And so if that's the case, then the problem in Genesis chapter 6 is that angelic demons were impregnating human women, and that God's judgment came down because he wanted to stop the destruction of the line of humanity that he had promised redemption would come through. That's the strangest sounding one to our modern sensibilities, and it also draws on some concept that many cultures, and cultures in the ancient Near East and other cultures, have some kind of mythology around gods or demigods, divine beings, intermarrying with human beings. It's a familiar narrative across religious spectrum, and so that is a third possibility here. As far as which one it is, who knows? We really have no idea. The plainest reading of the text actually could steer you toward the most supernatural version of the demons impregnating women. I don't feel like that fits within the text. That idea is the Nephilim then are these, Hercules-type demigods. I don't feel like that fits within the biblical scope. I think I'm most prone to see the possibility of what Calvin goes with, with the line of Seth intermarrying with the line of Cain. I think that's possible. It could be the tyrannical aristocracy taking advantage of women. I'm really not sure. But I also think that this issue can actually take our focus off of what's most important in this passage. Because we get so caught up in trying to explain who the sons of God are and the daughters of man in Genesis 6 that we ignore the fact that it wasn't directly because of them that God brought the destruction of the flood. It tells us right in the text why he brought the destruction of the flood. It says in verse 5 of chapter 6, "The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord regretted that he had made man on earth. It grieved him to his heart. And so the Lord decided to blot them out." It says in verse 11, it goes on, "The earth was corrupt in God's sight, and it was filled with violence." And he said in verse 13, God said to Noah, "I have determined to make an end of all flesh for the reason the earth is filled with violence through them." And so the reason that God ends up bringing the flood in judgment is because of the violence of humanity. Now that's something that we can understand. When we look around us, we see violence everywhere. And it's not just the battles, it's not just ISIS, it's not just human history and the major wars that have been fought, it's not just the threat of nuclear war right now in Korea. There's violence that happens in our neighborhoods, there's violence that happens in relationships, because the human heart is turned inward, it's selfish, it's prideful, and it will act out for our own good individually, which ultimately is violence against others. So the reason that God brings destruction is because of the violence of humanity against each other. He wants a clean slate, a starting point. And his judgment is poured out. And then the main point of the flood narrative, though, isn't even the judgment of God, because the judgment of God here is justifiable. And I know that we get a little bit squeamish about God's judgment. We want to think, we have a tendency to think, how could he be a judgmental God? Is he angry? And the reality is that the biblical presentation from start to finish is that the issue is not God's violence against humanity, but humanity's violence that brings his rightful correction. And so God's rightful response to human beings being terrible and sinful and violent and destructive toward each other is to say, at some point, you will have to answer to him for your violence. The same way that if anybody takes a swing at one of my daughters, they will have to answer to me as their dad. And so God's judgment is actually something we can find comfort in and know that justice will come in the end. So that's what happens in the flood, is it's the outpouring of God's rightful justice against the violence of humanity. But the main point of the flood story it comes in chapter 8, verse 1, that God remembered Noah. And so in the midst of the rightful outpouring of his wrath and judgment on sinful humanity, he remembers Noah. And that doesn't mean he forgot him and was like, oh yeah, there's a guy in a boat. What it does mean is that he remembered his promises to Noah. He remembered his promise in Genesis 3 to the first man and the first woman, to Adam and Eve, that the seed of the woman would destroy the serpent in the end. He remembered that it was through a human being that he was going to bring the ultimate justice, but through a human being also that he would bring the ultimate satisfaction of rightful godly wrath. And so in remembering Noah, he remembered all of his promises to Noah, and in the midst of his rightful judgment. And Noah, again, wasn't righteous. The guy had his own problems that surfaced as soon as he was out of that boat. But God promised that he would never destroy the earth by water again. And Christ came, the ultimate seed of the woman, the one who would satisfy God's wrath, who would bring us into righteousness, so that we could be saved by and a part of the promises of God. And so that's the point of Genesis 6 through chapter 9, the flood narrative. The sons of God, daughters of man stuff is interesting. It's fascinating to think about. It's a little bit bizarre and feels a little bit mythological to think about some of the possibilities. And it's not unimportant things to consider. But the reason God destroyed the earth with a flood was not primarily because of the identity of the sons of God or the daughters of man. It was because of the violence of humanity against each other. So David, I hope that helps. If you have watched Ask Pastor Bill and it's been helpful to you, send us some questions. We'd love to hear from you and be able to bring up whether it's tough texts, issues of life, issues of the church, anything that's on your mind. We'd love to hear from you.